The first one comes from InfoSecurity Magazine, and the title here is 58% of ransomware victims forced to shut down operations. Woo! And despite what the headline might lead you to believe, they're not talking about like going out of business, shut down operations. They mean that they're temporarily halted production type of shutdown. So
in some
in
sense.
some way,
Yeah.
correct. So this is a article about a report from the Ponemon Institute, and it's called the Global Cost of Ransomware Study, and it does a fair amount of contrasting between results from the same report in 2021 with new updated results from 2024. There were some interesting statistics that I pulled out of both the article and the report itself. I'll just kind of step through some of the highlights. Let's see. That, as the headline would lead you to believe, there was an increase in the number of victims that had to shut down their operations. It was 45%, went up to 58% last year. There was an increased number of victims that indicated they had suffered significant revenue loss, and was up from 22 to 40%. We did get better. They did see a reduction in the time it took to recover from an attack from 190 hours to 132 hours. They said that the average amount demanded in a ransomware attack is $1.2 million. They cited that 51% of the responses indicated that their organization would never pay a ransom. But then they also say that 51% of victims did pay the ransom. And you might say, well, how could that be? In the
math
the math doesn't
ain't
math.
mathin'. Yeah.
Well, the reason is that they surveyed people who were not like the survey included people who were not also victims. So if there were let's say there were 1,000 people, I think there was over 2,500 respondents, but let's say 1,000 people, 500 of them had suffered a ransomware attack and 500 didn't. And of the total population, 51% is saying they would never pay a ransom. And of the subset that did experience the attack, 51% did pay the ransom. And they had some reasons why. They cite some reasons why that the victims paid the ransom. They didn't want their data leaked. They couldn't afford the downtime. They had cyber insurance, which I think is a terrible reason to pay a ransom. But there it is.
But is it? I mean, we can think about that for a second. Like, I think a lot of executives think about this exactly for that reason. Like, it's why I have insurance. Well, it's my easy button to get back up and running.
It is, but then you go into the next section of the report.
Yes.
And this is where it gets really interesting. They said only 13% of victims who paid the ransom received all their data back.
Yeah, that was very surprising to me.
40%.
So only 13%. But let's center on that for just a second. Like, the entire ransomware ecosystem model is based on people believing they're going to get their stuff back, or stop the exfiltration, or stop the extortion, or whatever it is, if they pay. And if we're down to 13%, that basically starts to, if that becomes widespread knowledge and people believe that and it's true, that starts to destroy the entire market pressure for ever paying.
Absolutely.
It destroys the entire ransomware model.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Like criminals, like, we have fought so much against ransomware for the past, 5, 6, 7 years?
Long time.
And it may collapse under its own greed before anything else happens.
It's interesting because this is not, I don't know that this is necessarily a new finding. Like, I think most organizations have this intuition, and I suspect that they're paying on the chance that they get lucky and are one of the 13%, I suppose.
Are you saying you can't trust criminals?
No, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. But
There's no honor amongst thieves?
there's no honor amongst thieves, which, by the way, uh, dovetails into some of the other stats they had, which is that even after paying, 40% said that their data was still leaked, which again, highlights a big problem. Like if you are a
Mm-hmm.
victim and you still have a 40% chance of your data being leaked, and that's the primary motivation for you paying the ransom, that's not great odds. And then 32% indicated that the attackers demanded more money after they paid the initial ransom.
Jeez.
So that's amazing.
Yeah. It. I've always been somewhat pragmatic about this. I've always said a business has to make its own decision based on the circumstances they're in at the time. Like if you're now I keep using filler words. Sorry, I got to get better about that. If you're a hospital and it's disrupting critical care, you may choose to pay that ransom. And I'm not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily mad about that. But if there's very little chance of that payment actually resulting in the outcome you want, this changes the entire equation. And now it's just, no, it's just not an option. It's not going to yield what you want, and you're wasting time and energy on that. And don't count on it as a solve. Have a different solution
Right.
beforehand. Yeah.
Right. And that by the way is there's an equal set of reasons for the 49% that didn't pay, the victims that didn't pay the ransom, and things like they had backups and their data wasn't that important and whatnot. But I think that going forward, organizations that are victimized, if they are going to pay, really need to be doing a little more homework on who their who their hacker is, because I suspect that if you were to really look at the landscape, you would very likely find that there are some actors who reliably will deliver on the ability to recover your data or not release your data or not demand more money. And I suspect that there are others who are very unreliable in those dimensions. And so I'm not sure that this is like one homogenous whole.
What's the best way to look that up? Do they like have Yelp scores or like Better Business Bureau scores of like
I, I suspect that a lot of the incident response organizations like your CrowdStrikes and your Mandiants and whatnot, I suspect
I
have the
you know
ability to
what?
guide on that.
I think our next business model is to start a ransomware threat actor rating system for,
Like Yelp.
1 out of
I
five
think the
stars.
I think the Yelp is the Yelp model is a very good idea.
Yeah. How good was their customer support? Were they responsive? Was the
Hmm?
data in good shape when it was returned to you? Was it fed and watered properly? You could have like a 6 or 7 tiered ranking system that I think this could be helpful. I think the VCs would line up for us.
Absolutely.
I'm,
Absolutely.
I'm gonna I'm gonna write out the business plan. Keep going.
It's a fabulous idea. So this report also indicates a couple of important indications on how the attacks started. Again, for the victims, the actual victims, they indicated that 45% of ransomware attacks, unsurprisingly, started with phishing.
Mm.
32%. This one was surprising. 32% started with RDP compromises. I
So
just didn't realize it was that common.
yeah,
And
that
then
both of those feel to me like password related problems. So that both could be
yes,
solved with phishing resistant MFA.
right,
Interesting. Sorry, go on.
quite likely so. And then 19% are exploiting software vulnerabilities. So I suspect your intuition that it may not be that all of those are identity related compromises. Maybe there's some configuration related, or some of the phishing is
Mm-hmm.
malware, you know, installing a Trojan or something like that. But I suspect that your intuition is correct, that if you were to have the right kind of identity in place, identity management in place, that very likely would have mitigated a lot of it. And then they go on to say,
Yeah.
by the way, once they get in,
Mm-hmm.
they say 52% of the actors are using missing patches in the internal environment to move around laterally. 47% are using weak passwords. 35% are using local administrator weaknesses. I don't exactly know
Hmm.
what that means, but again, lots of opportunity to improve. And I think this is, again, intuitive to me at least. A lot of organizations view vulnerabilities that are only exist internally as much less significant, and
Yep.
actors are taking advantage of that fact. Once they get in, they're able to move around laterally. There was one other takeaway I had from this, because
What's that?
they talk about some of the hazards or the things that happen in as part of these ransomware attacks, and encrypting data is only one of them. It's also very obviously it's stealing copies and disclosing copies of your data. It's denial
Mm-hmm.
of service attacks, and a range of other things, like contacting your customers or the actual end victims and so on. The thing that struck me was, we continue to talk about ransomware as if it's some kind of software that gets installed on a system. And I think that this is a much broader category of attack now than just like a piece of software that in every case gets installed on a system that like, this is bigger than what we had seen in the past with
Mm-hmm.
regards to, because it's what I'm trying to say is that not every one of these attacks actually involves actual malware. Sometimes they're using, as we've talked about in the past, like they're using the native functions in Amazon S3 buckets to encrypt data. They're they're just stealing the data. They're just downloading the data and deleting it without actually using any custom tools. They're like FTPing the data off the server. So anyway, it's a pedantic thing, but I think that we perhaps need to eventually find a new term, because I think ransomware, at least in my mind, is kind of a narrow, it has some narrow applicability implied in it.
Yeah. It's becoming more like digital extortion or cyber extortion might be
Exactly. Right.
a more accurate term.
Right.
Speaking of, I think you said the average demand from the bad actor was 1.2 million.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting because that's also your speaker appearance fee. That's very coincidental.
Totally. Totally coincidental. Not in any way related. I
Mm-hmm.
promise.
Mm-hmm.
Promise. I
Mm-hmm.
promise. The other thing,
Anyway.
by the way, I want to say that this was a report put out by Ponemon, who is also the same organization that creates that cost of a data breach, which, by the way, in 2024 was $4.8 million, or almost $4.9 million. Um, and in this report, they talk about how the average cost to respond to a data breach dropped from $168,000 in 2021 to $146,000 in 2024. And I got to thinking, like, there's this thing that I'm now going to call the Ponemon tension, which is kind of like the Hubble tension. For those of you who are super nerds like me, the Hubble tension is the difference between the age of the universe as calculated by the cosmic microwave background radiation, and the latter is measure. This is, I think there's this thing that emerges between how you measure the cost of a data breach by the labor versus by, I don't know, some survey, tell me how much your data breach costs.
Right. I think it depends on who's paying for the survey.
I think so.
And for the record, we have often laughed uproariously at Ponemon's stats.
Yes. So I am now declaring the Ponemon tension. Now I think that some of it is explained by like the $4.8 million includes other stuff like fines and whatnot. But
well, and one thing we kind of skipped over in the article is that, quote, reputation and brand damage is now considered to be the biggest financial cost for ransomware attack, replacing costs associated with legal and regulatory action, not direct staff time to repair. But
right.
nonetheless, Ponemon's lawyers can send their cease and desist to jerry@defensivesecurity.org.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. I expect to see a Wikipedia article about the Ponemon tension soon. Okay. Anyway, by the way, it's an article or a report worth reading. Just obviously make sure you have the right context in your mind that these reports are funded by organizations who have their own marketing agenda. Right.
You might see that theme come up in another story today.
Oh yes. Oh yes.